Welcome to Podcapers, the official podcast of a place to hang your cape. And this week, we're talking with Greg Weisman, or as I like to call him, Spectacular Greg Weisman. Cue the music! Hello there, capers, and as I said, welcome to Podcapers, the official podcast of a place to hang your cape. My name is Scott James Merridew, and this is the show where I talk about various geek and nerd-related topics, and I'm joined each week by a very special different guest. My guest today, if you love something, he's worked on it. Gargoyles, Spectacular Spider-Man, Star Wars Rebels, Young Justice, Capers. Give it up for Greg Weisman. How are you, Greg?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Very excited to be talking to you. It's a lovely dark night here in Edinburgh. How's it where you are?
It's a bright sunny day in Los Angeles.
You stole the sun from us. How dare you?
It was always my plan.
But I think that's a trade worth having because, seriously, in terms of contributions to fan culture and some of the stuff you've worked on, you've given some of your dues. You really have.
I've tried.
You've tried your very best. And I think we're not going to waste any time. We're just going to talk about it. Now, it would be very easy for me to talk about how much I love this and that and the other because, well, I do. But I want to get into a bit more of the behind-the-scenes stuff, a bit more of your view and your perspective and your process when working with a lot of this stuff. So I think we should start not at the very, very beginning, but certainly one of the big ones at the beginning, Gargoyles. Now, here's the thing. I haven't watched Gargoyles until about a week or so ago because, I don't know if you know this, I have a bit of an aversion to anything coming from the dreaded House of Mouse. So I stayed away from Gargoyles for a long time, and I picked it up very, very recently, and I can do nothing but offer you my deepest and sincerest apologies because it is, I've only watched 5 episodes, but dear God, it's brilliant.
Well, thanks. You've got 60 more to go.
Oh, I'm in for a treat. It really is. I'm not going to gush about it because, again, only 5 episodes in, I want to talk more about it, but it really struck me right away with not only the quality of the animation, because right now, in terms of cartoons, with 1 or 2 exceptions, we are sincerely lacking for that, but also with the depth and complexity of its characters and the world and the tone. It really was very impressive. But one thing that really did intrigue me was that behind the scenes, it really did seem to be quite the collaborative developmental process. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it was definitely that. We developed the show initially as a comedy adventure show in the style of Gummy Bears.
Gummy Bears, bouncing here and there and everywhere. We can't get Chief David to do this thing, so we'll make it a bit darker.
Well, we didn't have Keith initially, obviously. So we had a comedy adventure show, and we pitched that to Michael Eisner, and he did not greenlight it. And my immediate bosses, Bruce Cranston and Gary Kreisel, still felt there was something worthwhile in the idea. And so they suggested I go back to the drawing board figuratively and try and find another way into it. And so I showed our comedy pitch to a handful of people just to get their opinion on it. And one of them, Ted Stone, the creator of Darkwing Duck, and you can now sing for Darkwing Duck.
I'm not going to do it. I did it once. I did a theme song for another Disney thing once. I can't do it again. It's the law of diminishing returns.
Okay, fair enough. So Tad suggested, we had all these fun little gargoyles. He suggested, what if instead of all these fun little gargoyles, you had one big gargoyle? He had seen an advanced view of the movie Beauty and the Beast, and we already had our human female character in the show. And he said, what if you did a sort of Beauty and the Beast kind of thing with it? And so that really hit for me. My background was actually in comic books and superheroes, and so we switched over. Greg Guler and I created the character of Goliath, and who did not exist in the comedy development at all. And we took the entire comedy development and put it through the prism of Goliath, and came out the other end fundamentally was the show that you've now seen. An action drama, still with humor, lots of romance and that sort of thing. And sort of a superhero genre show without any of the sort of hallmarks of it, in the sense that, no tights, no capes. We tried to ground it as much as we could, but in essence what you had was still that sort of bastard genre thing, which is what a superhero genre is. It's got mystery, it's got detective, it's got science fiction, it's got fantasy.
It's an umbrella term. It really is an umbrella
horror,
term.
Right, and it always has been, going back to the early days of Superman.
Superman, fighting for truth, justice, and preventing Lois Lane from turning into a centaur.
Always a good thing. So we pitched that show, and we came up with all these ideas for it, all these villains, all these supporting characters, and we created a huge, comprehensive pitch of all this stuff, all stuff that did end up getting into the show in one form or another. And we pitched that to Michael Eisner, and he passed. He didn't like it.
Damn it, Eisner, were you never happy?
And so we thought it was dead because he had killed it. And then the next day we had what we called a post-mortem meeting to discuss the shows, frankly, mostly to discuss the shows that had gotten a green light that day. So that meeting wasn't with Michael, that was with Jeffrey Katzenberg, and again, my bosses, Bruce and Gary. And when we were done, just as we were leaving, Jeffrey said to me, "And you're going to work on Gargoyles some more?" And I, said, "Well, no. I mean, we pitched it to Michael as a comedy. He didn't like it. We pitched it to him as an action drama. He didn't like it. I kind of figured he killed it." And Jeffrey looked at me and said, "No, he didn't kill it. He just thought it needed more work." Now, I had been there the other day, and that's
would have been nice of him to say.
Yeah, that's not what Michael had said, but what became clear is that Michael hadn't liked it, but Jeffrey had. And at least in those days, Jeffrey wasn't going to disagree with Michael in a room full of other people, but he felt there was still something there. And I know that my boss Gary had talked to Jeffrey about the need to diversify the Disney afternoon. And so we went back to the drawing board a third time to try and figure out how we were going to change the show. And the first thing we decided when we got there was that we weren't going to change the show. The show was great. The problem wasn't the show. The problem was the pitch. It was too big. It was too unwieldy. It was too distracting. There were too many elements to it. So what we did is we just cut the pitch way down, really focused it on the Beauty and the Beast story of Goliath and Elisa. And we touched a little bit on some of the supporting characters and a couple of the villains, but most of that stuff we just pulled out of the pitch. Now, not out of the show. It's all stuff, like I said, that eventually made it into the show.
Sell the sizzle, not the steak.
Exactly. And you can see that pitch if you buy the Season 1 DVD. You can see that pitch. It's one of the extras on the DVD. And that pitch, that third pitch, sold the show. And from that point on, Michael was 100% in our corner on Gargoyles, and we got going. Now, we didn't have any producers for the show yet. I created it and developed it with my team, but we didn't have any producers, and it took us a while to find the right director-producer for it, Frank Parr, and the right story editor, Michael Reeves. So while all that searching for these people who we didn't have at Disney at that time, because we hadn't ever done a show like that at Disney yet, as Disney TV Animation, the show still had deadlines to meet and had to move forward. And so I wound up making a lot of decisions that normally would have been made by producers on the show. So that by the time we found Michael and found Frank, I didn't want to give the show up. I was too invested in it. I've been working on it for years at that point, literally.
It was your baby.
And it was my baby, and so I went to my bosses and said that I wanted to produce the show with Frank, and they were like, "Well, I don't know, you've never produced a show before," and I'm like, "That's true, but I never been a development executive before either," and that worked out okay. And so they allowed me to. I mean, it's more complicated than this, but the short answer is they allowed me to produce the show with Frank, and Frank and I produced a season 1 of 13 episodes and a season 2 of 52 episodes, and then we both left, and they did a third season that we don't count or talk about for ABC, and we don't think of it as canon because everything in it is just too far out of character for everyone in the show.
I mean, that's the thing. See, it's one thing when you develop something and you go through the process and you bring other people on board. It's another thing when you've got something going and a project is ongoing and it's been out there for a while, and then suddenly it's in the hands of someone else.
Yeah, it was tough. I mean, it was emotionally difficult for me, and to watch those. I've seen out of those 13 episodes, I wrote the first one, but it was re-edited by the people who replaced me. I don't like the way they re-edited it. And the other 12 that they did, I've seen all of them each exactly once and no more. They were all very painful for me. But we later did Gargoyles comic books, 18 issues of Gargoyles and Gargoyles Bad Guys. So we sort of think of those comics as the official third season.
And wasn't there a problem with the rights of those? Wasn't there a lot of legal issues surrounding those?
No, not really. I mean, Disney owns it outright. SLG licensed the rights to do the comics for 18 issues. And then at that point, the comics were doing well, and but Disney had bought Marvel. And so they were, at least for a period of time, trying to discourage other comic licenses because I didn't know what Marvel might want to do, might not want to do with Disney properties. So they raised the license fee on Gargoyles to such an extent that even though it was SLG's best-selling comic at the time, SLG couldn't afford to continue doing it with that heightened license fee. And so they had to give it up. But we had done 18 issues. It's a nice chunk of work. I'm proud of it. Want to do more, dying to do more, actually. But I'm, happy with what we did do. So we did 65 episodes, 18 comic book issues. It's not bad.
Yeah, and you've got a really close connection with Gargoyles and the fan base as well over these like 20 plus years.
It's true, yeah. I mean, for 13 years, from I think 97 to 87 to 2009. We did, no, that's not right either. 97 to 2009, we had an annual Gargoyles convention, fan run, but a lot of members of the cast and crew came to the convention year after year. I became very close with a number of the people who ran that convention, and I'm still friends with a lot of them, and Gargoyles fans are just the best. They're the greatest.
Yeah, well, I'm swiftly becoming one of them, so thank you for that compliment. And I do find it very interesting that you've taken such a direct role in being a fan base and sort of overseeing it, if you will. It's very difficult to oversee a fan base, but I think you're right in there, and you often see a lot of creators like Stan Lee goes to conventions and things like that. But I think it's rare that you get involved in like the actual running of the conventions or talk to people who run the convention, stuff like that. And I think that's really good.
It's mostly gratifying to me. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It's a huge ego boost most of the time. Every once in a while, someone lays into me, but it's pretty rare. And usually it's on the internet when it's anonymous.
I think after all this time, I think you've earned an ego boost by this point.
Well, thanks. Yeah, and it is. It basically works pretty well for me, and I always had a great time. I was always pretty upfront about how gratifying it was, and the fans are great, and love interacting. We would talk, we'd have like panels about gargoyle biology and gargoyle culture, and we'd get pretty deep on those subjects and others like it. And it wasn't just about, hey, why did he turn left in that episode instead of turning right? It became about what was sort of behind it, the diversity that we promoted in the show, and
the interesting stuff. The interesting stuff.
I think so, yeah.
Absolutely. And the thing is that with Gargoyles from the start, but one thing where you didn't come in at the start, you came in a bit later, was W.I.T.C.H. Now, I remember watching W.I.T.C.H as a kid. I never watched Gargoyles, but I did watch W.I.T.C.H, which is very hard to say very quickly. And I really enjoyed it. But I wanted to know, what was it like for you coming in after the first season's gone? Because you came in for the second season.
Yeah. It was, I had a really great time on W.I.T.C.H, and I'm really proud of the 26 episodes we did. I came in, I watched all 26 of the episodes that preceded mine in season 1. I think they had a great pilot and a great 2-part pilot and a great 2-part end of series. And then they had a problem partway through, which was that the series was originally designed to go on the Disney Channel here in the United States, and the marching orders were to make it more of a sitcom with a little bit of magic in it. So you see a bunch of early episodes that are very sort of sitcom-y.
They go on a snowboarding holiday. Oh no, that weird gremlin thing's gotten into the food all of a sudden. Wah, wah.
Well, right. So, and then partway through the season, Disney decided that it wasn't going to go on the Disney Channel. It was going to go on Toon Disney, which was in theory a boys' action network, at least at the time. And so they were saying, we got to get boys to watch the show, and of course you've got a show about 5 girls with fairy wings, and it's not an obvious slam dunk for that audience. But they came to me and I said, yeah, I can do this. We just have to go deeper on it. And so they wound up doing sort of, like I said, a great 2-part pilot, a bunch of fun, really fun, but intentionally sort of sitcom-y things for 5 or 6, maybe 10 episodes. I can't quite remember now. And then they tried to make it a sort of boys' action show, and they kind of just did Monster of the Week. Here's the plant monster. Here's the invisible monster. Here's the
mind control horn.
Right. And so it felt very repetitive, and the ratings had started out very high and then began to fall off. So in the attempt to sort of course correct, they brought me in. And I did what I usually do, which is to sort of go deep on this show. And I studied the first 26 episodes and found elements in it that I liked. I studied the Witch comic books and found lots of stuff there, lots of material. And then I weaved this sort of storyline that would have individual standalone episodes, but also have an arc to it, and really grow the characters and grow the villains and proceed forward. And I think we wound up having a really impressive season for that back 26. Now, the bad news is that they had lost so much of the audience during the first season. We held what they gave us, but they didn't market the show much in season 2, and so we never got back the large audience that they had started with. And so we only got to do that one additional season 2. And I think that's too bad, because I think the show had a lot of potential, and I would have loved to have done more on it.
'Cause I do remember the show. I do remember the characters and the world they inhabited. It was rather fun. I honestly, when I was a kid, when I was a young lad, I didn't really care that they had fairy wings and had magical powers because they were cool. They had like fire powers and earth powers and air powers, and with their powers combined, they summoned forth Captain Planet. Wait, no, wait, that's the other thing. But it was still a lot of fun, and it's a shame that it didn't have as much staying power. But I think the fact that I remember it and my friend Mark, who often comes on the show, remembers it, is a real testament to your abilities as well, but also the work of everyone else came before you and worked with you. In fact, Mark did have a question for you that I'm going to read out if you don't mind. This comes from Mark Russell Capers, and his question is this. Well, I always love how the story for Witch unfolded, with brilliant chess moves by the heroes and villains throughout, particularly the villainous Narissa, how she formed the Knights of Vengeance from former members of Phobos to weaken the power of Aelion, then the Knights of Destruction and the steps she took to regain her powers as a former Gadin, the Witch recruit Phobos to help them, but they know fully well that he would try to get powers, they set up a scheme to strip him his powers, and then fucking Cedric, you badass mother trucker! That wasn't really a question, was it?
I have no idea, because it was funny the way you started talking fast, but it also made it impossible for me to understand what you were saying.
Basically, he said that he really liked the second season.
Well, that's great. You know, Narissa was a terrific villain. We had a blast with that character, and
if you get a good villain, you've got a good show.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, you know, one of the things that we try to specialize in and is, you know, Demona and Xanatos in Gargoyles, I think, were two really unique villains. I think Narissa was coming from a really unique place, and she was an interesting and complex villain. And I think that, you know, it's something I've tried to do in all my work is make the villains worthy of the heroes they're fighting.
Absolutely, because if you're going to have a decent conflict, you've got to have decent stakes, and that's got to come from the antagonist. It really does, I think, personally, make or break a show. And thankfully, you've provided that many times. And you've done that in several different roles. You've been a supervising producer, executive producer, co-producer. I was wondering, could you tell us a bit about what the difference is between those roles, if there is any difference?
There's absolutely no difference whatsoever.
I knew it!
The problem with the producer title is that it can mean anything. So the title that matters is showrunner, but that's not a credit you ever see on screen. But what you need to know on any given series, television series, is who's the showrunner. So I was Frank Parr and I were the two showrunners on Gargoyles. I was the showrunner on season 2 of Witch. Vic Cook and I were the showrunners on Spectacular Spider-Man. Brandon Vietti and I are the showrunners on Young Justice. Dave Filoni, Simon Kinberg, and I were the showrunners on season 1 of Star Wars Rebels. I left after season 1, so I'm not sure who took over after. I think it was Henry Gilroy, but I'm not sure. But that's the key thing. You know, whether I'm a supervising producer, a supervisory producer, a co-producer, an executive producer, none of that stuff matters. That's all contractual. And, you know, there are people on shows that I've worked on who had executive producer credits who never did anything on the show, but contractually they were listed as producers. On the other hand, you also have line producers who do a lot of day-to-day work on the show, and you have showrunners who are sort of the creative heads of the show, and associate producers and assistant producers and production managers and all sorts of titles. But if you're trying to figure out who's running it, you need to figure out who the showrunner is. And again, that's not a credit you see on the air. It's just behind the scenes. That's who you're looking to be the creative lead on a show. One or two people, usually it's one or two people, I suppose it could be more, who are creatively in charge of the direction of the show.
Because there needs to be some sort of chain of command.
Yeah, their on-screen title could be anything.
Yeah, well, the little sneak peek into the world of Hollywood there, folks. No one knows what they're doing. Yes, they do. I'm joking. And speaking of Spectacular Spider-Man, I mean, you know this as well as I do. It's the best Spider-Man cartoon ever made. It is.
Well, thank you. I like it.
Of course you like it. It's the best one. I mean, I'll admit to you now, it's not my favorite. Okay, I fully admit that it's the best. I love it, but for me, it comes a close second to MTV Spider-Man that preceded it. Because I mean, Neil Patrick Harris as Spider-Man. I mean, you've got me. You've got me.
Did he play Spider-Man or did he play Harry?
No, he played Spider-Man. Ian Ziering of a Sharknado fame played a Harry Osborn.
Okay.
It's weird, guys. That was before Sharknado. But yeah, that's always had a very close place in my heart. But I think out of all the Spider-Man cartoons, and goodness knows there have been a lot, it was Spectacular Spider-Man that understood the character, understood the world he inhabited, and understood the tone, perfect tone, but also what changes needed to be made. You were not going to make something that's been made before. You weren't going to do the original comics word for word again. You weren't going to do the 90s one word for word again. You wanted to do your own thing that seemed reminiscent of something, but also felt very much... the word I'm looking for is timeless, I guess. So I want to know is, how did you feel about it in comparisons to the previous cartoons?
Well, I mean, we... started out, Vic Cook and I, with what we called the 5 C's, which is that we wanted it to be classic, contemporary, cohesive, coherent, and this is cheating a little, but there's a hard C in it, iconic. So we wanted you to look at a character, whether it was J. Jonah Jameson or Doc Ock or Spider-Man himself, and immediately go, yep, that's who that character is. Not going, who is that supposed to be? We wanted to visually feel iconic. And we wanted the storytelling to have that classic feel, to appeal to our viewers in the same way that Stan and Steve's Spider-Man appealed to comic book readers in the 60s. And so we very much were inspired by the work of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. and later stuff too. I mean, we brought in Venom and other characters that showed up later in the series, but and we weaved a story that and an origin for supervillains and superpowers that felt cohesive and coherent, but we very much wanted it in a contemporary world. So those were sort of the big 5 C's for us in adapting Spider-Man for the screen. And I said this back at the time, and it sounded arrogant, and I meant it in a way, not to be arrogant, but to show our ambition, which is that we wanted Spectacular to be as definitive a Spider-Man series as Batman the Animated Series had been for Batman. We weren't emulating Batman the Animated Series, but we wanted people to walk away and go, yeah, that's Spider-Man, the same way people walked away from the work of Bruce Timm and Alan Burnett and said, yeah, that's Batman.
Well, I think that's the perfect attitude going in to have, because it would have been so easy for you to do another Spider-Man cartoon. Because, I mean, the latest one we've got, I don't know if you've seen it, after the one that followed after Ultimate, it's, based on what I've seen, what I know of it, it's a Spider-Man cartoon. There's nothing really unique about it. There's nothing very interesting about it. There's 1 or 2 reimaginings of some characters I guess you might find kind of interesting, but for the most part, and again, I think this is go back to the animation, it really is just very bland and mediocre and by the numbers. And I really don't think any cartoon should be by the numbers. It needs to stand out, and it needs to be definitive. As you say, you need to look at it and not mistake it for anything else. And you really accomplished that, which is why it's so perplexing to me that it was cancelled, which I'm still not over. And I have to ask, what was like your reaction to the team's reaction in the room, as it were, when the news started filtering in?
Well, you got to keep in mind that by the time we found out that we weren't going to be able to make more, most of the production crew had already been laid off because we were in post, and there was nothing for the artists to do, nothing for voice actors to do, it was just a handful of us, Vic and myself, a couple editors, and our line producer, and it wasn't a full crew by that time. But the thing to keep in mind is, and this is going to sound like I'm splitting hairs, but I don't mean it to, we weren't canceled in the classic sense. Our ratings were terrific. We weren't picked up, and the reason we weren't picked up had nothing to do with the show and everything to do with contracts. So the problem was that having nothing to do with our show, Sony had given the animation rights back to Marvel in exchange for some concessions about, the obviously much more lucrative live-action feature film business. So Marvel,
which worked out so well for them.
Well, I mean, I know you say that sarcastically, but the truth of the matter is if you're talking about raw dollars, it did work out really well for them. The amount of money that, the amount of money that even the worst of the, and I don't mean worst creatively, I mean even the poorest performing of those movies brought in was way more than Spectacular ever brought in. And things that fans can't forget is that these are publicly held companies that need to make the maximum amount of money off of their stuff, and it's just that simple. And people say, oh, they're so commercial and they got no soul, and my reaction is, yes, and
that's what they're for. They're there to make money.
Yeah, they're there to make money and give those of us who have soul the opportunity to do some good stuff. And sort of forgetting that is kind of silly, I feel, because if you forget that, people are going, well, whether it's Spectacular Spider-Man or Gargoyles or whatever, they should, those damn companies, well, if it weren't for those damn companies, we wouldn't have gotten to make any of it.
Yeah.
If it weren't that the companies thought they could make money on this stuff, they wouldn't make any of it. And so they traded the animation rights for some concessions on the feature film. And what that meant is that Marvel now had the right to produce animated materials with the Spider-Man character. What Marvel didn't have the right to do was do the specific version of Spectacular Spider-Man, because Sony owned that version of the character. Now, Sony couldn't make it because they'd given the animation rights on what you call the intellectual property of Spider-Man back to Marvel. But Marvel couldn't make Spectacular either because the rights on that specific version of the character were held by Sony. So it created this catch-22 that made it impossible for either company to produce that version of the show. And to be fair to Marvel, Marvel now owned their character, their marquee character, and they wanted a shot to make their own Spider-Man show, which is what Ultimate was. And I've never watched Ultimate. I literally have no opinion on it whatsoever. I've never seen it. There was no reason for me to watch it because there's no good news for me in that. If it turned out to be great, I'd be jealous, and if it turned out to be awful, I'd be angry. So I just didn't watch it. And I have no idea whether it was good or bad, but what I do know about that show and about the show that they're making now is that they're incredibly talented people working on both versions of that show. I don't know what they did with it. I don't need to know, but I know they're great people who worked on every version. And I'm glad that people sort of still look back on ours as we come up on the 10th anniversary of it this fall and go, yours was the definitive one. That's what we set out to do. But, the business side of it did end up sort of hamstringing us and make it impossible to do a third season. And that's a shame, but it's also, that's the breaks.
I think it's one of those things where we can be sad that it's gone, but more importantly, we should be happy that it existed in the first place, as you said. And I'm very happy it existed in the first place. Like, my life is richer. Many people's lives are richer for it having been in it. And that's one of the great things about Spider-Man. He has this ability, the character has the ability to touch us all in a very deep and profound way. And I do have to ask, I mean, no, you haven't kept touch with any of the cartoon stuff. Have you seen like the PS4 game by any chance?
No, I'm not a gamer. I don't really play any games.
If you're going to start gaming at any point, if you ever get to decide, you know, I might start playing video games, start with that one, because, I mean, it's one thing to create a cartoon about Spider-Man, it's one thing to read a Spider-Man comic, it's another thing entirely to feel like you are Spider-Man.
Yeah, I mean, my buddy Yuri Lowenthal is playing Spider-Man in a game now, and I think, you know, Yuri's great, and I'm sure he's doing a great Peter Parker and everything, but I'm the kind of guy, you know, if I start playing these games, you know, I get my character, I walk out, and I get killed like 3 seconds in. I'm like, okay, let me try again. And I won't make that mistake. And so I go out, and then I get killed 3 seconds in. I have shitty hand-eye coordination. And my mind doesn't work that way, and I'm just no good at it. It's not fun for me. So I'm not a gamer at all, but so I've worked on a lot of properties that either began as games or continue to be games. I wrote 2 novels based on World of Warcraft. I'm currently working on a couple novels for Magic the Gathering. I love the worlds that they create, but I'm not the guy. I'm not a player.
So let's talk about those novels, because you did. Was it called Arena? No.
Reign of the Ghosts.
Yes, Reign of the Ghosts. No, I was confusing it with Ravnica. Yeah, Reign of the Ghosts. But after that, you did the World of Warcraft. You've done 2 World of Warcraft novels.
I did 2 novels based on my original story idea, Reign of the Ghosts, and its sequel, Spirits of Ash and Foam. Mm-hmm. And then I did 2 World of Warcraft novels called Traveler and
The Spiral Path. Is that what it's called?
And The Spiral Path, yeah. And now I'm working on a Magic the Gathering novel called Ravnica.
Yeah, so what is it about those was that you like? What made you want to do a story about those?
Well, I mean, I'll be honest. Initially, you know, I got mortgage payments and kids in college, and I need money.
You're a working writer. That's how it works.
Right, and so I was approached about World of Warcraft a few years ago, and this year about Magic the Gathering. And, you know, it sounds very mercenary, but the truth is that I don't say yes to these things unless I think I can do a good job on them. And what was great about both those sort of universes, the Blizzard's World of Warcraft universe and Wizard of the Coast Magic the Gathering universe, is they're very rich, just like, you know, doing the Spider-Man universe or doing Witch or doing Young Justice. These are all, you know, giving me a lot of great material to work with and making me feel like, okay, you know, I love world building. This allows me to play in a very big sandbox, but also to make my mark in it and create something that I hope will be lasting. And so I really enjoy doing that sort of thing. There's an element of adaptation to it, but also there's just an element of getting your hands dirty, digging in and saying, okay, I'm not going to try and do the entire, you know, Magic the Gathering multiverse in one book, but I am going to focus on these characters in this location, and in this crisis situation, I'm going to get my hands dirty. And you know, almost all the characters in the new Ravnica book are existing characters. There are a couple of new characters, but mostly there are characters that were created by great people who came before me. Just like when we did Spider-Man, we tried not to do a single, and succeeded, I think, in not doing a single named character in the show. I'm not talking about like bus driver number 2, but any character who was important enough to have a name, we pulled from the Spider-Man mythos, whether it was the football coach or the drama teacher or the cops or anyone. If they were important enough to need a name, then we would find that from the rich source that was the Spider-Man corner of the Marvel Universe.
Yeah, and then that's what I love about when people who really do adaptations like that, because it means that the general audience, people maybe who haven't read the comics or know a lot of these characters, were just like, oh, it's just another character, another interesting standout side character. Okay, fine. But people who have read the comics like me, were just like, oh, it's Corey Grant, oh, it's Hobie Brown, yay! And it's a really win-win scenario, and that's why I really don't like it when a lot of people do stuff and even I don't want to say twist or warp things, but try and focus on one particular demographic rather than covering as many bases as they can. Simply because, I mean, otherwise you're going to end up disappointing some people. If you make it too insular to the fandom, then you're going to alienate general audiences. There's a whole reverse side to that. So it really is interesting trying to get that sort of balance. Which is, there's another question that I have for you, is that in terms of balance, what is it like? Because you've worked in comics, you've worked on novels yourself, but you've also worked in television. And I often want to ask, what's the difference in working in a team in terms of television and working in a team in terms of comics?
TV and comics actually aren't that different. The biggest difference is just the quantity of collaborators. A TV production involves literally hundreds of people. And that's a lot to coordinate. It takes a lot of people to help you coordinate it. Even if your creative vision is clear, you've still got all these people and all this materials you have to coordinate. In a comic book, I'm basically working with the editor if I'm not editing myself, and the artist, a little bit with the colorist. It's all, frankly, easier from a logistics standpoint. I don't want to make it sound like it's easier to make a good comic than it is to make a good TV show. But it's logistically, without a doubt, simpler to work with a team of 5 or 6 people as opposed to a team of, 150 to 200 people.
So similar sort of framework, but just sort of scaled down.
Right. Writing a novel is different. When I work in cartoons or in comics, I try obviously to write the best scripts I can write, but I can't draw it all, and I'm very dependent on a number of other talented people to help bring that stuff to life, whether it's on the comic book page or on the television screen. And when I'm writing a novel, it's just me. I mean, I've got an editor, I've got someone I can bounce stuff off of, but that's not the same thing. Everything's dependent on the prose. So when I wrote my first novel, Reign of the Ghosts, I quickly realized that stuff I was used to doing, used to having as a tool, like music, for example, musical scoring, which I've had the luck of to have amazing composers like Carl Johnson on Gargoyles, like Lolita Ritmanis and Christopher Carter and Michael McQuistion on both Spider-Man and Young Justice. And they create this musical score which brings an emotion and a feeling to a piece that goes beyond what's in the writing. It works off of what's in the writing, but it goes beyond that. I've had amazing character designers like Sean Galloway on Spider-Man, or Phil Barassa on Young Justice, or Greg Guler and many others actually on Gargoyles. And again, they bring those characters to life. But if I'm writing a novel, I've got to, in prose, describe what they look like. I've got to compensate for the lack of music in the quote-unquote poetry of the writing. And I don't literally mean poetry, it's still prose, but in the manner of the writing has to compensate for the lack of music. An interesting thing that I discovered in writing the second book of any series is that, when you introduce characters for the first time, you describe them great. The trick to the second book is, I've got to describe these characters again. Like if I'm writing the second episode of a TV series, I don't have to describe Peter Parker the second time. I just say Peter Parker shows up because I've got a piece of art that shows you him. But in the second book, I've got to describe this character again, and I can't use the perfect words I found in the first book. Whether it's a setting or a character or whatever, I've got to find new ways to describe things that I've already, sweated blood over. And that was tremendously challenging, is how do I find a way to describe the character of Rain or the hotel, the bed and breakfast where she lives, or any of this stuff the second time.
Well, I imagine you could use it as an opportunity to describe how they've changed since the last time we saw them. Not just physical change.
Well, that's easy to say, except, for example, so far at least, in each of my second novels picked up, and I'm not kidding, literally right after the first novel ended.
Ooh.
So, I mean, obviously they'd gone through emotional stuff in the first novel, but visually, no difference at all. This wasn't 5 years later or even 6 months later. This was, hey, remember 5 minutes ago when that book ended? We're picking up right after it. And that was true for my second Reign of the Ghost novel, Spirits of Ash and Foam, and for my second Warcraft Traveler novel, Spiral Path. Both of them picked up literally right where the first book left off. I'm not 100% sure that's what's going to happen for Ravnica, although it seems like it probably will. So it's challenging. It's not undoable, but it's definitely a challenge.
Absolutely, and I think that's what writers need. They need a challenge. If it was easy, A, everyone would do it, and B, that might not necessarily be fun to read, because you can tell on the page when the writer has put the effort in and tried to either circumnavigate the natural pitfalls that come with writing, but also just try and present a story in the best way possible, because otherwise you get lazy stuff, and I can't abide that.
Well, I think that's true, but I also think that, again, the other major difference between writing a novel and working in comics or television is the isolation. So, and I don't mind that. I don't mind bouncing back and forth. When I was doing the first season of Star Wars Rebels, I was also writing Spirits of Ash and Foam at the same time. And there was something that was kind of great about that, because it's wonderful to have these collaborators who can help you out and who can solve problems with you and that sort of thing. But I'll admit, at times it's also frustrating to have collaborators, because you can't just do what you want to do. There's compromise, and there's
how dare you have a different opinion from me?
Right, exactly. And that is the nature of the beast, and it's a great thing. But I won't deny that sometimes it's frustrating. So it would be nice to occasionally go, okay, I'm going to put Star Wars aside for a second and work on Spirits, where I don't answer to anybody. And it's just the thing I want it to be in its purest form. The other aspect of that is that, the flip side of that is that you've got no one to help you. That it's just you and the blank screen, and you're on your own. And that's its own challenge. But what was great about working on the two books, the two projects simultaneously, Rebels and Spirit, was that, if I was writing or editing a script for Rebels and I hit a wall, I'm not talking about like writer's block, I'm just saying, temporarily I'm like, okay, I don't quite know how to solve this problem. I'd put it aside and go work on Spirits. And then I'm writing on Spirits, and I'd be going along just fine, and then at some point I'd hit a wall. It's like, I'm not quite sure how I want to phrase this or do this. So I put it aside and go back to Rebels, and almost without exception, by the time I went back to the other project, that problem had sort of sorted itself out in my head. When I wasn't focused on it, in the back of my mind, something clicked into place, and I would be able to go back and just keep writing straight through, or keep editing or whatever, and vice versa. So that from the standpoint of doing the two projects simultaneously, I never had, prolonged periods of downtime when I didn't quite know what to do because I could alternate back and forth between them.
It's almost like a brain workout. You can't just do bicep curls, you got to do your legs as well. You never skip leg day.
Right.
And
I mean, I skip anything related to exercise myself, but I agree with you.
Me too. I just thought it was such a convenient metaphor. And something you've been working a bit more recently, checked out, is a cartoon show called Shimmer and Shine. And that's
right.
I believe that's much for a much younger audience than some of the other stuff you've done. As far as I'm aware, it's about two GDs that grant wishes to the one of the actors from Back to the Future and Red Dawn.
I don't think so.
Leah Thompson. The character's name is Leah Thompson. The actor from Back to the Future.
Leah, I don't remember her ever having a last name, but maybe you're right. We never certainly wrote that last name, and I would have known that. But
maybe the internet
Leah.
lied to me. I don't know. But,
she was called Leah. Shimmer and Shine was a lot of fun to work on. That's an example of a show where I was not a showrunner. It was not my show. I was a staff writer on it, working with a great group of writers. Our story editor on the show was a wonderful, wonderful writer named Stephanie Simpson. And we had a number of incredibly talented other writers on the staff, and including Justin Ferrer and Kevin Hops and Francisco Paredes and Andrew Blanchett. And we just had a blast doing that show. It's a like you said, it's a preschool show, but I think it's a terrific show. I mean, again, it's not for the same audience as would watch Gargoyles or something like that, but for the audience it's designed for, I think it's really great.
Well, I only watched one.
I did that for about a year and a half, 2 years, just before I came back to do the third season of Young Justice.
I guess it was almost like a palate cleanser, if you will.
Yeah, it was also employment, which is always nice.
It's nice to be employed. Yeah, I thought it was. I was going to say, I only saw one bit. I think it was like a talent show where they're getting their pets to do a talent show. And I thought this is not something I'd really seek out if I weren't interviewing a guy that worked on it. But it was decent enough and like kind of fun. A couple of bits that made me laugh. Ooh, the tiger's chasing a leaf around a piano. Fun. But one thing I don't know if you're aware of, I thought was kind of surprising, was that it was dubbed for the United Kingdom. Some of the characters have British voice actors and British accents instead of American ones. And I find that very peculiar.
In which show?
In Shimmer and Shine.
I wasn't a showrunner on that show. I know I met a couple of the actors. The three lead kids were all American. Four lead kids were all American. And Zita is Lacey Chabert, who I've worked on many shows with, and she's American. And D. Bradley Baker is American. There may have been some British actors on Shimmer, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. I've worked with British actors on a number of shows I've done, including Star Wars Rebels and Gargoyles and others. Again, for Shimmer and Shine, I wasn't. I was just a staff writer there. I went to a few recordings, but not to all of them. I don't remember any British actors, at least not at the recordings I went to.
I just thought that was very interesting, because why would you want to dub something that's going to be in the same language, just with a slightly different accent? It makes no sense to me. But that's something that's been a bit more recent. Obviously, we can't talk about a Young Justice that goes right now, because if we do, Batman will come round to my flat and beat me up. But I do want. Are you working on anything else in the future? Is there anything else you'd like to work on going forward?
Well, there's always stuff I'd like to work on, but no, right now, my main focus is on season 3 of Young Justice. I'm doing an issue of the Young Justice companion comic, and I am I'm about a third of the way through Ravnica. So between those three things, I'm more than busy enough.
Yeah, you're good in terms of work for the moment. So Ravnica, that's coming out. When do you think that will come out?
That's really I don't know the answer to that yet. I don't know if they've announced the final date. I know when it's due, but I don't know when its release date is. I don't know if that's been announced yet. But it's definitely next year. I mean, it's in I would say the first half of 2019 for sure. I don't know if they've gotten more specific than that, but I know that the plan is it'll be sometime during the first half of 2019.
I'm sure many Magic the Gathering fans will await it with bated breath. Sadly, I'm not one of them. I've never played Magic the Gathering. That's never been something I got into. The only card game I ever played of that, I don't know if it's similar, is Yu-Gi-Oh? But that was just something I played when I was a kid.
I don't know. I mean, I like I said, I don't really play games. I did copious research, so I hope that the fans of Magic the Gathering honestly pity me a little bit. Take pity on me because no, I never played the game, but I want them to know that that doesn't mean I sort of came in like a dilettante. I have done tons and tons of research on the worlds, on the characters. I am trying to really get them right.
Yeah,
and
you're putting in the effort again.
The fact that I don't play is hopefully not going to be a problem for the enjoyment of the book.
Well, I think it's a case of you could be well versed in the game and played it ever since you were a fetus or something. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to write a good book. Knowing the lore and being familiar with the characters doesn't necessarily mean you can do a good thing. Like, I'm very familiar with Spider-Man. Maybe one day I could write a good Spider-Man TV show, but that is not guaranteed. It's not just the knowledge of the thing, it's the effort and the talent and putting it, again, just making sure you're trying to know what you're talking about, you're putting the effort in, and I think that's going to show. And that's something I think a lot of people that want to get into writing or work in media can really get behind. And on that note, I have to ask, so if you met someone that was wanted to work either as a writer or producer in television or comics or anything like that, what advice would you give them?
Well, my first piece of advice is to move to where the work is. People think that in this internet age, well, I can do this job from anywhere, and that's true once you're an established talent, and even then it's hard. Like I've been a professional writer since 1983, and I don't feel like I could move away and maintain my ability to earn a living outside of Los Angeles. I still don't feel I've reached the level where I could safely leave town and still manage to earn a good living. And when you're establishing yourself, you've got to be where the work is. So that's sort of the first thing. Second thing, of course, is to educate yourself. Really, that should be the first thing. And, you've got to, if you want to be a writer, any kind of writer, you got to learn to write. That doesn't mean literally being able to read and write a market list kind of thing. You've got to learn how to write. You've got to understand the rules of fiction. You may want to break those rules, but you can't break a rule you don't understand in the first place. You've got to learn to proofread. You've got to learn to read. And you've got to learn to research. And then on top of all that, you've got to learn how to sell yourself, which is an entirely different job that every writer also has to do. It's not enough to be a great writer. You've got to be a great writer who, on top of that, is a great salesman of either himself or herself or themselves or their work, but most likely of both. And I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm constantly auditioning for the next job, the next gig. I mean, constantly. It doesn't end just because I'm in my mid-50s and have been doing this for 30 years. That has changed nothing. I still have to, anytime I want a new gig, I got to go, in essence, sell myself off an audition and get people to buy into me as a writer. And then the other piece of advice I usually give, which is, if you can be happy doing anything else for a living, do that. Whether you're an actor, a dancer, an artist, a writer, any creative thing, if you can be happy letting that be your hobby while you do something else to earn money, that's what I would recommend. Nothing stops you from writing a novel, even if that's not how you earn your living. And nowadays it's even easier to self-publish, put it online, etc. And it's easier when you're not dependent on that for your bread and butter. And the only reason you should be going into a creative field to earn a living is because you literally feel like you can't do anything else, which is how I feel. I feel I am eminently unqualified to do absolutely anything else. And this is the only thing I could do. And so this is what I do. But I don't recommend it as a career unless you really feel that way, that you feel you have no other option but to work in whatever creative field you're choosing. If you can be happy, you can be happy writing a novel, putting it up online, selling it that way, and then you never know, it might turn out to be the next big thing. That's always possible. Not necessarily high percentage, but possible. It happens. And so if you can be happy that way, that's what I recommend.
It can't just be your passion, it has to be your raison d'etre. It has to be your reason for being.
Right. But passion's important. I mean, if you don't have that passion, it's not going to carry you through darker times, and those darker times come. People give you stupid notes. People tell you your work sucks. People fire you. I've been fired a lot. And it's hard. And you get rejected. You don't get jobs you wanted. You get a job that you thought you wanted, and it winds up being a nightmare. There's a lot of difficult things that happen in this business. So you need the passion to carry you through it, and you need to put that passion into the work, because if you're not passionate about it, how can you expect anyone watching it to be passionate about it?
And on that note, Capers, and those wise words of wisdom, we're going to end the show. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was great fun.
I'm so glad you had a good time. And if you enjoyed the show, Capers, please tell your friends. Shout it from the rooftops! And if you haven't already, go back and listen to some of our other super episodes. Like we talked about many of these shows before in the past. So you can go and listen to one of those. Sometimes we just mention them. And you can listen to the show on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, Spotify, or at podcapers.com. We have a Patreon. Check out the rewards. Patreon.com/AP2HYC. If you want to get in touch with us, suggest show topics, or maybe come on the show yourself, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at AP2HYC, or email us at podcapers@ap2hyc.com. Thank you very much for Dan Harris for our logo, the lovely microphone, the red and blue 3D glasses, those are mine. And thank you for listening. And Capers, just in case you weren't aware, our next Halloween special is coming up later. Oh, blimey, you are going to want to keep your ears peeled for that. So, this has been Podcapers, the official podcast of a place to hang your cape. Cue the music!